Bruce Johnson here, and welcome to the Wire to Grow show, where we help business owners and entrepreneurs learn how to better design, lead, manage, and market more scalable and successful businesses. Our sponsor today is attract more clients like clockwork. If you're ready to get off that feast or famine client attraction cycle where you have some, don't have some, don't have some, and would like to get on a more consistent flow of having new clients come in, then make sure you check out attractmoreclientslikeclockwork.com, www.attractmoreclientslikeclockwork.com. Our guest today, as you can see, is Ghais. Aaron is an equity partner at the law firm of Schulman, Rogers, Gandel, Porty, and Eckert in Potomac, Maryland. And if you're in the area, it's right at the corner where 270 and 495 hit. It's a big, tall building there. Aaron is a transactional attorney, and he really specializes in mergers and acquisitions and M&A activity. And over the last couple of years, he's done over 300 deals, over $3 billion worth of deals. And he's really begun to specialize in helping serial acquirers, those companies that want to drive growth through acquisition. So it seemed appropriate to have Aaron come back on the Wire to Grow show to talk about, in this case, the buy side of the equation instead of the sell side. So Aaron, welcome to the Wire to Grow show.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Always a pleasure to be with you. And I guess the last time we did this a couple years ago, talking about considerations for companies or owners of companies looking to sell their business. So now we're going to do the flip side of that, which is what happens when you want to grow your business through acquisitions. So it's a good fit. And I should just put a plug in for you to say that I owe so much to you for all the success I've experienced in recent years. And you and I have been working together for more years than I can count or at least remember. So it's been a pleasure, and thanks for having me.
Well, thank you so much for the positive plug. So for those of you who haven't listened to the first one, Aaron, why don't you just kind of quickly bring us up to speed as to, out of all the legal profession options, why you decided to focus in on mergers and acquisitions? What is it about that you just love?
There's a lot I love. I love the fact that it's a very constructive process. We're helping businesses grow, business owners make money if it's on the sell side from the sale of their business, but it's a constructive process, and I like that better than the litigation side, which to me can be very destructive and wasteful. But from a personal standpoint, I also like the excitement of putting deals together, serving clients in their hours of need, the competitive aspect of negotiating, and then ultimately deals don't get done unless the parties reconcile to the fact that really the process needs to be collaborative. So working with a lot of smart people to put complicated arrangements in place and get that closed where everybody's happy is really a fun and rewarding way to spend your career.
Absolutely. Kind of reminds me of my wife's a labor and delivery nurse. It's the good part of the hospital, right? It's very positive most of the time. People, the company that acquires feels good, and the company that sold feels good in most cases.
Well, yeah, hopefully, but nobody does it better than the owner of the ice cream store. Nobody leaves there unhappy. So, we're not quite at that level, but we try to be.
Exactly. Okay, so let's walk back. I'm a business owner. When should I start thinking about, or what would be some of the reasons why I should be thinking about using acquisitions as a growth strategy?
Right, and that's obviously what we're talking about, is how do you drive growth through acquisitions? And I guess there's an underlying question of whether growing through acquisitions is the right thing for you as a business owner, because there are, of course, other ways to grow. For example, you can just grow organically by investing in your own business and your own people and avoiding the pitfalls and risks and expense of growing through acquisition. But growing organically can be time-consuming, can require a lot of investment and risk in itself. And so then you wonder, well, what is good about growing through acquisitions and what's bad about it? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at in some of what we'll discuss today. So, and there's a lot to be said both on the pro side and the con side. But you start to think about growing through acquisitions when you have access to capital to pay for the acquisition. When speed is important, so you may not have time to grow organically, because that can be a very long process. Whereas if you go and acquire a company that's in an area or space that you want to move into, within a matter of months, you can be operating in that space. If there's a technology or access to a contract that you can get quickly through an acquisition, then an acquisition might be the way to go.
So I'm assuming in the DC metro area that last one was probably a typical one. Someone tries
Correct.
to buy into a contract.
Yeah, you got it. I mean, there are a lot of government contracting companies in the area. There are large contract vehicles, they're called, which are, if you can become, have the right to get work from that contract vehicle, you can make a lot of money, and not every company has that right. So if I don't have access to that vehicle, but another company does, and I acquire that company, I can get instant access to that workflow that comes out of that contract. So in the government contract sector, that's often why acquisitions are done.
Now, based on your experience of working with companies in a number of transactions, is there like a certain size where somebody starts to think, okay, organic isn't enough? Do I need to be like a 40, 50, $100 million company, or can I think sooner about acquisitions?
No, it's not necessarily about how big the company is or how big do you need to be until you can go and consider growing through acquisitions. So, for example, one of my clients was a small company owned by a very seasoned gentleman who was in government contracting for many years, cashed out of his old business, wanted to get into a new line of government contracting, had access to capital in the current environment.
Mm-hmm.
Bank loans are easily obtained at low rates, and he used a nice sizable loan for his startup company to buy another company that had access to a contracting vehicle that was in an area that he's very familiar with and felt very comfortable working in. So that was a startup company, and the bank was willing to finance that loan using as collateral the prospective cash flow of the target company. So my client didn't even need a lot of existing assets to put up as collateral for that loan. On the other hand, but I contrast that with another client of mine that's actually $1 billion distributor and of a commodity, and basically the assets that this company looks to acquire are contracts, supply contracts. Mm-hmm. It's that simple, and they go out and buy other companies that have these supply contracts, and that's the only way they can grow. It's just too difficult for them to go out and line up those contracts one by one. So they'll go buy companies that have hundreds of these contracts and do a number of those deals on an ongoing basis. And that's, as I said, that's $1 billion company. Right. So it's really not about size. It's about other considerations. And so access to capital is a huge one. And of course, with debt being so readily available now, it's a good time to buy, assuming that you can find sellers who are willing to sell at a reasonable price, assuming that there's a prospect for future growth in that business, assuming that there are no fatal flaws in the target company. And I could go on listing these sort of assumptions, but these are kind of the business considerations that you think about when deciding whether to pursue an acquisition strategy.
So one of the myths, I'm guessing we can come out of this, would be that people would assume that I have to be a certain size to do it. I don't. And I also don't have to be the larger company in the acquisition.
Correct. If you can get the capital, there's no reason a smaller company can't buy a larger one. Or you can do a merger of equals, as it's called. So that really speaks as much as anything to the governance, so that the bigger company may not be enthused about giving up control about portions of the business, but you can negotiate arrangements to share control after the deal is done. So
excellent. Right. Okay, so let's just say I'm a $2, $5, $10 million company. You've convinced me I don't have to be a $50 million company. I'm starting to think maybe this is the year we should go out and acquire somebody. Like, what are the first couple steps that I should be thinking about as a business owner if I'm going to think about doing an acquisition?
Yeah, sure. Well, first you have to have a compelling business reason to engage in that process, because it's labor intensive, it's costly, it's a distraction from your main business. So you need to understand that there's a real time commitment there as well.
Right.
But once you've gotten over that hurdle, the next thing is to get the right people in place. And you want a group of internal advisors and external advisors to assist you. internally, you want people that are equipped to help you with the acquisition process leading up to closing, and then also to help you with the integration and transition planning that happens after the acquisition is completed. Those are two sides of the same coin, but equally critical. And if you don't have the right people around, you need to start looking for somebody to bring in. And it need not necessarily be employees, but you can get out advisors as well. So then when you think about your outside team, you want at least the following. You want a good legal advisor, and you want a really good business advisor. And then along with that is if you have a good accountant, that can be very critical. And an investment banker, if different from your business advisor, to help you identify and evaluate potential targets. And right there, you're talking at least about 4 people. So I give you an example, and I've seen this done right at least a few times, where
which isn't sounding good, by the way, if you've done hundreds of them and you found a couple.
And I'll speak to that in a moment. But ideally, you get this team together. I have a client that did this. They interviewed prospective advisors way ahead of time. They said, this is our plan. This is how we want to grow. They eliminated the people from the list that they didn't think were good, and they had a meeting of the so-called dream team, and it was really well orchestrated. It would put us in a position to get to know each other socially and then to work together really well as a team, and that's so critical, whether it's in the acquisition in an acquisition strategy or on the sell side. It's really the same, the same kind of. It's important for the same reasons, I should say. So ideally, no deal can be driven just by a lawyer or just by an investment banker. You really need everybody working together and communicating clearly, not competing for the client's attention or to be the favorite child, the golden child, but you're really a team serving the client.
Yeah, typically a business owner will often have a deal guy come along and say, hey, I got a company I think you might like to acquire. And so I think a lot of business owners often start out with kind of a deal guy, and then they kind of go to their to their accountant. And then usually the attorney's kind of late in the process. Your recommendation is the attorney should be a little bit earlier in the process. So why don't you help explain why?
Yeah, sure. And that sounds self-serving, but it's not meant to be. And I'll give you an example. But that's exactly right. And, often successful business people are risk takers. They're willing to shoot from the hip. They, they behave from instinct and gut reactions, and that often serves them well. But this is an example of a situation where business owners should resist that impulse to shoot from the hip and be more calculating, because there's a lot to be gained or lost. And so by way of example, I'm working with a client now. We'll be closing a deal hopefully in a few weeks. But the business owner started the process by negotiating a letter of intent with the sellers many months ago without our input. And the letter of intent was set up to provide for an acquisition by my client of the stock of the selling company, not the assets. And we'll talk about different ways to do later about how to structure these deals. So they signed the letter of intent. It was non-binding, but still, when you sign a letter of intent, there's an expectation that's created, and it's hard to oftentimes to move off of the positions and the provisions that are in that letter of intent. Brought it to us. We quickly figured out that this really should not be done by our client as a stock acquisition. It should be an asset acquisition. And so as a result, we were able to negotiate for that change in structure. But sure enough, the seller extracted some significant concessions, one of which was to say, look, I'll change, this was the seller speaking, I'll change our deal from an stock to an asset deal. But some of the disadvantages, I don't want to suffer any of the disadvantages that come along with that.
Right.
So as a matter of principle, again, with kind of limited input from us to our client said, yeah, okay, we get that. And then the seller held our feet to the fire on that. And we sure enough heard that on several occasions when we were trying to negotiate some what would otherwise be kind of customary terms in the asset purchase agreement.
Excellent. So having done hundreds of these deals, right, we mentioned some of them are successful, some aren't. if you were to look back on, a couple hundred of those and try to say, what are the major deal killers? What are the things that usually fall apart? What would be some of those that typically make it fall apart?
Sure. I'd say, and this is, again, we could do an hour on this, and in fact, I have a blog post that I wrote in my gettingdealsdone.net blog site. I wrote this blog post after giving a presentation with one of my clients to a group where we talked. The group was the Exit Planning Exchange, and it's a group of advisors, people who advise sellers in the sale process. And I brought a client to this meeting who's the general counsel of a serial acquirer, and the meeting was about what is in the mind of the buyer, know what's in the mind of the buyer. And so that blog post came out of that talk, and I go into some detail into some of the things that tank deals, because often it's the buyer that pushes away.
Right.
But, I'd say, right off the top of my head, I'd say failed expectations, bad counsel on the seller side.
What would be? Go back to that. You said failed expectations. So, give me an example.
Sure. The very easy and all too common for sellers to overpromise what they can deliver and how clean their company is, how ready they might be to sell, how happy their customers are, and so forth. And the buyer, that creates an expectation in the buyer as far as whether or not the seller is a strong target for acquisition. So on the basis of reliance on those kind of the assurances, the buyer then starts the process. And as I said, it's an expensive and time-consuming process, not to be embarked upon lightly. When a buyer gets in and starts to find that things aren't as rosy as the seller portrayed, the expectations, you start to get some failed expectations, and then it's really on the seller at that point to manage those expectations. And so sellers often fumble that process by not being as forthcoming as they should be, and as a result, the buyer becomes very suspicious and immediately starts to believe that if they're hiding this thing, what else are they hiding? And sellers often aren't counseled well in managing that sort of diligence process and the disclosure of things that might be material to the buyer's consideration. So I think that's...
Yeah, going back to our earlier interview, one of the things you talked about was for owners to make sure they clean up their books, right? Because that usually ends up being a problem that blows up a deal because their books aren't as clean. So on the other side, it would be finding owners who don't have clean books.
Bingo, and good memory, by the way.
Thank you.
And
I actually listened.
And so that leads to a second thing that often causes deals to fail, which is the seller's just really not ready to sell, and that's something else we spoke in some detail about, which is the process of getting a company ready for sale can be one that takes years, and really, if properly done, a person starting a business is already looking to how to exit that business and preparing for that day.
Right.
But as you know better than I think many business owners don't do that. So when they get an offer to sell, they're shooting from the hip just like many buyers do.
Right.
Yes, let's get this done. And that's when we jump into this cold water and quickly start to learn that there's a lot that needs to get cleaned up, as we say, before this company's ready to sell. Often it's because the buyer's doing due diligence, spotting problems, saying that, we offered you $20 million for this business, but with this problem, we're thinking 15 is the right number. Now you've got a failed expectation on the seller's side. Now everybody's scrambling.
Right.
And the seller's now on his or her advisors to clean up that problem, and that becomes a costly affair that takes time and causes delays. And again, acquisitions are a way for buyers to get into a business line quickly, more quickly than organic growth. If they see that there will be unreasonable delays causing unreasonable expense, they're very likely to pull out of the deal. And so that's sort of why if the seller is not ready to sell, the buyer may just walk away. so I think that probably leads to the third item, the third reason that comes immediately to mind.
Right.
Is just poor counsel on, and it could be business counsel, but here I'll focus on legal counsel on the seller side. And it's important, as a buyer to, when you're, or in the early stages, speaking with your seller, your prospective target, the
right.
owners there, to insist that they get good counsel. And it may seem counterintuitive. As a buyer, you might be thinking, the last thing I want is a really skillful lawyer on the other side. The next thing I know, I'm going to be, giving away everything I own to buy this company. But I'd say to the contrary, if your counsel is competent, they're talking the same language, and there's an adversarial side of the negotiation process. And if you have a skillful lawyer on the other side, there might be tough going. But at some point, the process does devolve, if that's the right word, into a collaborative process. And if they're speaking the same language and understanding each other, are familiar with how to do these deals, and by and large, I think in my experience that usually results in a more efficient process, believe it or not. And so I give many examples, unfortunately, of deals that were a lot more difficult than they should have been because counsel on the other side just was spotting the wrong issues and making mountains out of molehills where he shouldn't have, where the personality was just wrong for a transactional lawyer, creating unnecessary friction, and so I'd say that's a third area.
We just kind of mentioned in that first one about checking books. So from a due diligence standpoint, are there a couple other things that I should be thinking as a business owner that I need to make sure I'm doing my due diligence on before we get too far in the process? So one of them obviously are their books. Anything else?
Oh, there's so much, Bruce, on due diligence. Yeah, for sure. And usually due diligence proceeds along two tracks. There's the business due diligence and the legal due diligence. And the business diligence should start sooner, usually does start earlier, because the business people are getting involved in looking at the target before legal counsel really gets asked to jump in and really take a close look. So, on the business side is certainly, we could say a lot about that. On the legal side, since I'm a lawyer and this is really about the legal side of the acquisition process and driving growth, the issues kind of fall into kind of probably buckets or baskets of issues across a number of areas. So if the target company is in a regulated area, compliance with the wherever the applicable regulatory regime is critical, and what is their history of compliance? What sort of infrastructure do they have in place to ensure compliance? If they are if they have employees, which most companies do, lots of them, employee benefit plans, there's a lot of regulation there to be concerned about. Tax is always front and center, including in the structuring of the acquisition, and tax liabilities. Has the target complied with their tax obligations to pay tax on a timely basis? What else could we talk about here? I guess I always want to think also when you're as a buyer, you may, for example, if you have investors, you're a larger buyer and they're had investments made in your company by venture investors, you have to be cognizant of what restrictions there may be in your own organizational documents as that relate to acquisitions. So the ability to take debt on or to do acquisitions may require you to, you will have to go to your board, but is there any sort of stockholder vote needed by any of the preferred investors that might be in your company? So there's that internal look as well as looking at the target company.
Cool. You opened up the legal question there on the due diligence side. So let's just keep on that track. So as I'm starting to work this process, I've been doing my due diligence. What are some of the key legal questions that come up over the course of the transaction that are really big things I should be thinking about as the owner?
As the owner, the key legal questions usually starts with structure and how should we structure this deal? Or do we structure it as an asset acquisition, a stock purchase, or a merger? And I think I'll delve into those in a moment. It starts there, and then the questions that come up as a result of the due diligence, and that's really where you're just looking under stones and seeing if there are any problems there that need to be addressed. Intellectual property ownership is a really important legal question. So many companies are service companies, knowledge-based businesses, where ownership of ideas is really important. And so if I look at a target company and it's in the tech area, for example, and I see that target company doesn't own its own intellectual property, but it's licensing it from another third party, that may be cause for concern for me, because I much prefer that they own that intellectual property.
Right.
If it's a business that makes money because it has a lot of contracts to provide services or to deliver products, that the terms of those contracts are critical in many respects. So, for example, what is the duration of those contracts, and are they subject to termination? And what is the history of payment from customers, and are the customers happy? So, in real estate, I mean, we could go on like this, but so if it's a real estate business, if there are leases, what's the history of the relationship with the tenants, and what are the duration of the leases, or some of the same issues that could come up in contracts and as I mentioned, in businesses that say supply services. So these are some of the legal questions. I'm trying to think. I think.
What's really valuable, I think, for most of us listening is that as a business owner, you're probably the natural bent is going to be thinking about the business side of it and not the legal side of it. But if you want to be successful in the acquisition process, you need to make sure you have the great attorney who's going to process through all the legal stuff, because that can trip you up. You're probably better figuring out the business side and not the legal side.
And that's where a good investment banker comes into play. I think investment bankers probably get sometimes as bad a rap as attorneys until you really need a good one.
Is that possible?
I know. And we like to joke that investment bankers just set up the conference calls and push us to close as quickly as possible, because that's when they get paid. But the truth is they add tremendous value, usually on the front end, in putting the deal together, identifying a good target, evaluating the strength of the target's business, and then helping to smooth over business-related concerns that come up, both by advising and counseling the buyer himself, but also where sellers raise issues, they can translate concerns and help resolve anxiety, help in the overall process in a way that a lawyer really often can't. And so, at the very least, you want that investment for a sizable deal. You don't always need an investment banker. You always need somebody with a smart business mind, and ideally somebody who's not the main principal or founder, because they're often so emotionally invested. They're not always in the best position to think clearly on their own.
By the way, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Because
So
the people who are listening here are probably in that category, right?
Correct.
They're probably the founder, the person who's thinking about driving growth through acquisition, and your counsel to them would be, you're not the best person to make these decisions simply because you're emotionally invested in this baby that you grew, and now you need to make some business decisions that you might not be as objective.
Yes, or as informed about. You might know your own company really, really well, but it's really helpful to have objective, seasoned advisors, and again, ideally a business and legal advisor who work together very, very well, communicate clearly, and are responsive to the principle of the company that's going to make the acquisitions.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned just a moment ago that there are a couple different ways to structure the deal. So I know you talk about there are 3 different ways to do that. So kind of 3 major ways. What are they? And then kind of what are the pros and cons of each?
Sure, Bruce. Happy to. So the 3 basic ways are to structure an acquisition are a stock purchase, an asset purchase, or a merger.
Okay.
And the pros and cons on all 3, and there are hybrids and different ways to mix and match, but we won't get into that. Just to keep it at a basic level, if I want to buy a company that's owned by you and your wife, and you own it 50-50, a simple approach would be for me to buy the stock that you and your wife own in the company.
Okay.
You and your wife would be the seller. The seller would not be the company. I'd buy your stock, and having done so, I would own 100% of your company and all of the assets and liabilities that are in that company, including what we lawyers worry about a lot, which are just contingent liabilities, things that might arise that you don't know about now that are relate to your operation of the business before I bought it. And so whatever liabilities in the company that you put there or created are now mine, and that can be unsettling. And my only protection is to ask you to indemnify me for any losses that result from that, and that's a hard-fought negotiation.
So if I bury nuclear waste someplace,
right,
that would be the problem.
That's it. I own it. It's mine. It's mine. And there are other lesser problems that are, often still very costly that, I'm going to sweat. And so the benefit of that is that because I'm not buying the assets from the company, nothing needs to be assigned to me as the buyer in terms of contracts. I don't have to rehire the employees that used to work for you.
Right.
If you had licenses or permits that were hard to get and they're in the company, they're yours. And now I own them because I own your company. In government contracting, often this is the way deals are done, notwithstanding the pitfalls, because it can be very difficult if I buy the assets of a government contract company. I don't get those government contracts unless they're, as it said, novated to the buyer, which is a fancy word for assigned to the buyer but subject to government review that can take months. So I don't want to go through that process. I'd rather avoid that and just buy whatever you have and take what you have. So one downside of acquiring the stock, in addition to the liability point that I just mentioned, is that I get the assets that you own at their current level of depreciation. So if they're fully depreciated, I won't have anything more to depreciate. And that's different from the asset sale, which I'll mention that. So that's the second way to do a deal, to structure a deal, is to say that, Bruce, I don't want to buy the stock that you and your wife own for these reasons. I want to buy the assets that the company owns. So in that instance, you and your wife aren't the sellers anymore. The company is the seller. And I'm buying the assets from the company. And so at closing, the seller will actually be assigning the assets of that company to me. Why do I like that as a buyer? For a few reasons. One is, one is I get what's called a stepped up basis in the assets. So meaning whatever I pay for the assets becomes the new basis for those assets in my hands. So there's more benefit that accrues as a result of my ability to depreciate those assets over time. Also, I can cherry pick assets if there are things I don't like, or I can cherry pick liabilities. There are liabilities that I don't want or I'm not willing to accept and it's negotiated. I can choose to specifically exclude those, so I avoid some of that liability that might come along with actually owning those, as I might if I bought your whole company. Another pitfall. The pitfall of doing that though is that many times there are leases or there are important customer contracts that cannot be assigned to me as the buyer unless we go to the counterparties, and that in this case the counterparty to the lease, the third party to the contract, and actually get their consent to assign that contract. And I would have to do that if the relevant contract or lease requires or prohibits an assignment of the contract without getting that consent ahead of time. So that sounds like a lot of lawyer talk, but the upshot is it can create delay and expense. And many times, landlords, being landlords, you go to them to seek consent to an assignment, and they immediately start looking for concessions and ways to make money out of it. So it can become a dicey discussion. Although sometimes landlords are happy to accept the to consent to the assignment if the buyer is a healthier, stronger tenant. If that's what we're talking about. So that's the stock purchase and the asset.
And you can see, by the way, you can see that in the government contracting world, I'm assuming, pretty easily, because there are companies that the government would never give a contract to that they want to review. Because, let's just say, I'm assuming it's a Chinese company that's controlled, and the government doesn't want that on a cybersecurity detail.
That's for sure. That's for sure.
Yeah.
So the third approach is to buy a company through merger, and a merger is much like a stock purchase in that at the end of the day, the buyer is ultimately getting the stock of the target company. So you'd ask, why ever do a merger? Why not just do it through a stock purchase? And again, a number of reasons, but often we change our thinking or an approach from a stock purchase to a merger if there are more than, say, a handful or two handfuls of stockholders. Because you can imagine in a stock sale, again, if it's just you and your wife, you're both parties. If there are 20 people, now I'm, as the buyer, negotiating with 20 prospective sellers. Many or all of them will have their own lawyers. That's a ludicrous proposition. So how can I get to the same end result? And the answer is through a merger, which is a statutorily driven process that allows me as the buyer to acquire the target if on the target side the requisite number of shareholders approve the merger, and that if I as the buyer comply with the the statutory requirements for that merger, it's a way for me to get a deal done, even if there are a number of or some of the shareholders are objecting to the deal and not wanting to go along with the deal. We can still, it's not quite a squeeze out per se, but we can get the deal done notwithstanding their objections. So it's a more efficient process. And like with a stock purchase, if I acquire your company through merger, I am inheriting all that you have in terms of liabilities and contingent prospective liabilities. But it's also easier because we don't have to transition employees, we don't have to transition assets. It's all right there, and so at least theoretically, the day after we close, I'm standing in your shoes, and we got the business ready to go as it was the day before.
Excellent. Now, in the last conversation, we talked a fair amount about earnouts. So from the buyer's perspective, last time we were talking about the seller's perspective, but for this time, how should I be thinking as a buyer about whether or not I want to earn out, and how do I want to structure that?
So earnouts can be mutually beneficial and mutually problematic.
Okay.
Earnouts are helpful in bridging a disagreement between the buyer and seller as to the value of the company. And so from the seller's side, it may be that there's really no deal to be had unless the seller agrees to some sort of earn-out arrangement. Of course, the seller wants all of his money in cash paid upfront at closing, and as a buyer, I'd like to defer payment. Probably, I'll never get away with deferring all of it, but at least some of it to some future date, because it's easier for me to finance and a little less risk. So the earn-out allows us to figure out a way to tie my obligation to pay a portion of the purchase price to the future performance of the company. So if the seller's giving me assurances about how great a company this is and how he thinks it's going to perform, or she thinks it's going to perform over the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, then I can say, all right, put your money where your mouth is. If it performs that well, we'll pay out this much. In fact, if it performs better than that, maybe we'll even give you, a little something extra. But if it underperforms, we won't pay you at all, or we'll pay you a portion of, that amount. And so it allows the buyer and the seller to share some of the risk as to future performance. And I mentioned it can be mutually problematic because they're very difficult to negotiate, and the bigger and more complicated the deal, the harder the negotiation is, the more prolonged it is. Some of the number of important issues, and I have some blog posts again on my site, gettingdealsdone.net, that get into some of this. But one of the things, if you're a seller, you can imagine that, is particularly if you have plans to stick around for a couple of years after the sale to help the buyer grow the business, is that as a seller, a seller's going to want to maximize his or her involvement in the business to try to assure himself that everything possible will be done to get the seller his or her earn-out. So to cause the company to succeed, and the seller in his mind thinks, there's no way this buyer is going to know my business. It's got to be me making these calls. Whereas the buyer's saying, I'm paying all this money, I make the decisions. This isn't yours anymore. So there's often a long discussion, negotiation about control and who makes what decisions, and how many restrictions can the seller impose on the buyer's ability to run the business that he's buying. And you can imagine that can be a very touchy discussion. Other questions come up about how do you measure performance? What should the target performance threshold be, if achieved, would require the buyer to pay the earnout. So these discussions go on, and they're difficult ones. Then after you close the deal, if the earnout targets aren't met, you can imagine in many instances that the seller then says they would have been met if the buyer did what the buyer was supposed to do, and so you end up litigating earnouts. So earnouts as well as other purchase price adjustments are often cited as the most heavily litigated aspects of M&A transactions.
So from your experience of a couple hundred deals now, would you say that most buyers want that key person to stay on for a year or two, or would you say most would prefer to just be clean on day one?
It really depends, and if the buyer is buying into a brand new, buying a company in an area, an industry that the buyer is not currently operating in, it's a new area, they may realize that they're going to be really dependent upon the seller, the principal of the seller, the management team of the seller to remain involved. I think in that instance, ideally, the founder's gone, but the management team comes over and maybe not loyal to the principal founder anymore, buy their loyalty with a healthy compensation package, but often the founder, the key seller there, wants to stay on, willing to stay on, or wants to stay on to assure payment of an earnout. And again, often the buyer will need that help in the transition for a year or two or three. But if it's in an area that the buyer knows very well, obviously less necessary to keep that person on, and I think often we'll be happy to see the founder gone.
Yeah, interesting. Now, we talked about structuring. The other part of that really is kind of the financial part of it. So are there a couple different ways to finance that I should be thinking about as a owner thinking about driving growth through acquisition?
Sure. At least three ways to finance a deal. One would be just out of the company.
By the way, you're sounding like a preacher. There are three ways to do everything. I love it.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, you're the preacher in the house. Maybe I've been hanging out with you too long. I don't know. So beg,
three ways
lie,
to finance.
Steal.
Sorry, that's my bad.
Beg, lie, and steal. I don't know. Is that? You pay for it out of the company's coffers. Just that's easy, and maybe not the best financial approach, but that's not my area. The company can borrow the money, or it can get money through equity investments, and so I'll touch on the second and third choices there.
Okay.
So if interest rates are low, and banks are eager to lend, that's it's a great way to go, and there may be ways to shield the exposure of the buyer from liability if things go south. However, that may not happen. Often banks will ask for personal guarantees from the owners of the company taking the loan.
Right.
And also there's another consideration which relates to our discussion about the earnout, and also if the buyer is using promissory notes to pay or promise to pay the seller in the future some portion of the purchase price, as is it's not unusual for that to be the case. In fact, it's true for this deal that I'm closing in a few weeks. There's an earnout and there are two promissory notes. The bank that will be lending to my client to do the deal will insist that the seller's right to receive payment under the note or the earnout will be subordinated to the bank's right to get repaid from the buyer. So in other words, the bank steps in between the seller and the buyer and says to the buyer, it creates an agreement with the seller that the buyer is aware of. And it's basically saying, Mr. Seller, you're not getting paid by the buyer unless the buyer can first repay the debt owed to me. That'd be an extreme example. Often that's set up in a slightly different way, in which the bank would say, if the buyer goes into default under the loan that the buyer took to pay you, Mr. Seller, for your company, only in the default scenario does the bank step in between and get a first right of payment. But that can be quite unsettling, and actually can be a deal killer in some instances for the seller, because then the seller's thinking, well, geez, let me get this straight. Not only do I have to, stand by and hope that my company hits the earnout targets, which I don't know if they will or they won't, and I just lost, a lot of control here, and I'm not sure this buyer really has the wherewithal to do what I was able to do because I was great, and the buyer's not as great. And now we're almost like a bit of a partnership of sorts, that we have some shared risk and shared reward. But not only do I have to worry about that, but I also have to worry about the possibility that the company that the buyer won't do well won't be able to service the debt, and then I'll see none of that, and I probably won't see anything on the promissory note that the seller delivered to, or the buyer delivered to the seller at closing to pay for a portion of the purchase price. And so,
wow.
If that makes sense, that was a lot. That was a bowl of spaghetti there, but hopefully you followed it. But in terms of financing on the debt side, so I can take a loan as a buyer from the bank, as I mentioned, just described, but I can also take a loan from the seller. It's going to seller financed purchase.
Okay.
Basically, if you're the seller, you're helping me pay to buy your company by allowing me to pay you a portion of the purchase price later. And so, in effect, as a buyer, I'm taking a loan from you, and I would deliver a promissory note to you at closing that would say that I, as the buyer, promised to pay you X amount over X months or years, and that's how that's selling. And that may or may not be a secured loan, so with collateral. So then the other way, the third way, would be equity financed approach, where, and this is what private equity firms do regularly, which is to say that as a buyer, I've got a number of equity investors that have seen me succeed in the past. They would love to put more money in my hands so that I can go do something really, really smart, like go and buy your company, grow it over 5 years, and then sell it for, a 6x return, or something along those lines. And that can be a good way to go, because those investments by those investors, that's not debt, it's equity. So they go into that understanding that they're sharing the risk and they're making an investment decision and a bet that I can succeed. So I don't have to stay up at night worrying, we don't have some of those issues about subordination that I just described. So on the downside, getting that equity together, putting the agreements in place to structure ownership and decision-making control and return, that can be a painstaking process. It can take time, and as a buyer can cost me a lot of money in professional fees and just getting those arrangements in place. But serial acquirers often have the benefit of that equity backing, and often my ability as a buyer to get equity financing makes it a little easier for me, in fact, to get debt financing. So I may
interesting.
March in and get to a bank and get better terms. In fact, I'll probably at this point have partnered with a bank that understands my business, understands the strength of my equity investors, and hopefully see a track record of success over time, where we'll be able to put all this together. You do it right the first time, and then you can use that approach as a blueprint for future deals. And we've seen that. I've got a client that does that, and they've kind of upgraded banks a couple of times, but they're able pretty quickly to line up cash and get that money quickly and at reasonable terms to do acquisitions because of the track record of success that they've had.
That's awesome. So if you were to take all of this information and just say to me, Joe business owner, I'm thinking about driving this, what's the most important, or what are 2 or 3 of the most important things from today that you would say I need to make sure I walk away from this conversation knowing?
Okay. Let's see.
Threw you a loop there, huh?
Not really. I'm just trying to boil them down. I think number one is be sure that your plan to grow by acquisitions is a sound one from the business standpoint, because you don't want to chase a rabbit down the proverbial hole and incur a lot of fees in a protracted negotiation that goes nowhere good. Second is the shameless plug that is critical to have capable, seasoned counsel by your side, and to have them there as early as possible. Mm-hmm. For some of the reasons I discussed and others that I'd be happy to discuss, that it is a process fraught with legal risk and business reward. So if done well, the process of growing by acquisitions can be one in which the return is significant and outweighs by far the expense and the distraction of having engaged in that process. And thirdly, I think, if I had to pick a third one, I think I'd say that as important as the overall acquisition process is, in which you identify a target and negotiate the deal terms and get the deal closed, that the process of integrating target companies into your business is really the key to success. And that's where a lot of companies stumble, and many times, and I've been at this long enough that we're in a strong M&A cycle now, where plenty of companies have proven the benefits of growing through acquisition. But as soon as the markets turn for some other reason, you'll see articles in the paper about why M&A doesn't make sense and doesn't create the returns. And often, if you keep reading, you'll see that it's because the acquirers failed to integrate the businesses that they purchased effectively into their own companies. And that's a process you want to start planning for. Really, at the beginning of the process of even thinking about, to not only whether it makes sense to grow by acquisitions, fine, but then having made an acquisition, how will we integrate that into our current business lines, and how do we make that work? That's an important part of the thinking and planning.
In other words, just because the cost of capital is low now is not a good enough reason to engage in M&A activity.
Well said.
Hey, this has been great, Aaron. If somebody would like to get a hold of you, they are interested in this, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Sure. So I'm an equity partner at the law firm of Shulman Rogers. I co-chair our business and financial services department, and you can go to our website, shulmanrogers.com. You can go to my blog site, gettingdealsdone.net, or email me Ghais, Ghais, at shulmanrogers.com.
That'd be perfect. Well, I hope as you've been listening that you've gotten a lot of benefit, and you now have a lot more information about how you can actually drive growth through acquisition. And my guess is some of you are probably surprised, thinking, man, maybe this is something I could do. And so hopefully you're a little intrigued, and hopefully you'll contact Aaron. And for the rest of you who are just enjoying listening, hope you have a great week, and look forward to the next Wire to Grow show. So until then, to your accelerated success, Bruce out.